All right, I want everyone to know that it was hard to hear that song sitting down. I think that was totally not culturally appropriate. We should have all gotten up and danced.
I so wanted to.
Un poco de movimiento. We needed that, right? So, and just FYI, this is one of the side things that my Emmanuel is great at is música latina. So if you need some good worship, just email him, text him, team him, or whatever it means. And then I think as a reward, he might want a little bit of, saboritos or chips or something like that, right?
You got that right, of course.
To get the taste of Latinoism as well. Friends, I am thrilled to be in this space today. Actually, I'm in Akron today, Anchorage, Pennsylvania. This is my first trip to the East Coast since COVID, at least to Akron since COVID, and it feels kind of amazing to be in this space. The weather is better here than it is right now in my region, and it's starting to have a little bit of rain, so it just feels wonderful. It feels like fall is here. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everyone. Welcome MCC staff and board members. Welcome guests. Welcome amigos. We are starting our third webinar of our series of Color of Compromise. A year ago, if you guys may have heard, but we started on this journey of trying to figure out how do we share language? How do we all do some learning together across our regions and across our US? And so we took up this call to drive this work and this deeper connection by reading The Color of Compromise. And Jemar Tisby has been a gift to the church, a gift to many, a gift to MCC, as we've been diving in and understanding the complexity, the compromise, and the complicity of the church in terms of racism. Our first webinar speaker was Mark Charles, who, again, a friend, a colleague, and certainly a prophetic voice to the church today on the First Nations and the way Doctrine of Discovery destroyed much of the ways in which we could have been much further down the path in terms of understanding faith. Our second speaker was Ray Chan, who Ray shared with us about the Asian American experience. And today we have our guest speaker all the way from Chicago, who has been a friend, she's been a colleague, and certainly today she is going to share with us from her wealth of experience and knowledge. Her name is Sandra Maria Van Opstal. Sandra Maria is the second generation Latina pastor. She's an activist, an author, a powerful, let me just re-emphasize the word powerful, leading voice in the intersections of faith and justice. She's an executive director of Chasing Justice and the Black, Indigenous, People of Color-led movement that mobilizes the next generation of Christians to live justly. Sandra's distinctiveness comes from working in both the local and the global context as a practitioner and academic. This solidified her calling to disrupt oppressive systems within the church, to center marginalized voices. She's reached audiences around the world on topics of ethnic identity, reconciliation, global justice, worship, through international movements like Lausanne, the Justice Conference, Urbana Missions Conference. Her local influence is also propelled by, as she serves as an executive pastor at Grace and Peace Church in Chicago's West Side, as an activist in her community. She holds a master's degree in divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and is currently pursuing a doctoral work at Urban Leadership and Transformation. She's the author of The Next Worship, and as well as a contributor in a New York Times bestseller book called Rhythms of Prayer. This says a lot about her, but I just want to maybe do two personal pieces. There are very few folks who are so passionate about all of this, worship, Latinos, next generation, and who prepared themselves to speak in this way. And Sandra is certainly one. And she has an incredible heart of worship. I just want you to know that's how I met her at CCDA Central and we both serve on that board together. And she's just a gift to the church as well. So today, without any more delay, I want to introduce us all to Sandra Maria. Please, sister, share with us what God has put in your heart.
Well, I'm so excited to be with you all here from Chicago. It is a lovely and awesome day in Chicago, which we don't get a lot of. So it's great to have this kind of weather and to be in this space. If you can see behind me, there's a bookshelf with lots of things going on back there. That I'm the mother of two young kids, so first grade and second grade. And so we have been delighted to be establishing new patterns and new rhythms, as I'm sure many of you are in your own context. But I thought I would start by just sharing a little bit like a story, because I think that always helps us enter into who is this person that is sharing these things with us. So when I was entering into the first grade, like my son was this year, I was about the same age, six going on 7. And I remember very distinctly, my mother turned to me that evening and, or that day as I was leaving, and she kind of leaned over, if parents or grandparents or aunties, if you can imagine this moment, leaned over to like, give me a bendición as I went off to school. And as she did that, she leaned over and she said, you know, Sandrita, you don't have to tell anybody that you're Latina. You don't have to say anything. You can just feed in. And that was such a curious statement for me. I mean, imagine like how you're developing your own sense of self and identity. But I think what I was being taught by mi mama, who's a very proud Colombiana, was that being a Latina at home was okay. And we should be proud of our roots and our heritage, and we should definitely speak both languages and be connected to our roots. But if I could opt out of identifying as a Latina in places where that would secure me an advantage, then I should. And in my 20s, like Mordecai or to Esther, or like Moses when he had grown up, I saw the treatment of my people. I had eyes to see something I could not see before. And I began my journey towards reconciliation with God, with others, and really being reconciled to myself. That's how I would describe that. It was a reconciliation to myself, of understanding who I was and all of who I was, and what had been passed down to me. And so that story for me, while being both comical in some ways in my mind, I can remember it. I actually remember what I was wearing. I was wearing some Popeye embroidered pants, like, you know, the character Popeye from Kmart that my mom had bought me, and some shoes from Payless that looked like the shoes they were supposed to be, but they weren't quite the shoes. And I was going into a space where I didn't speak the language yet, so I was not fluent in English. I was fluent in Spanish and getting there in English. And the words that I heard were to prepare me for the type of racism that I would experience, and the type of xenophobia that I would experience as a young child in a very, very, very white suburb, as we had moved from urban Chicago into a suburb outside of the city. And so that is one of 3 very clear pictures for me of my childhood and of what it meant to understand my Latinidad in the midst of that. Now, I did go through a period of where I thought to myself, well, that was kind of cruel of my mom to do that. But I think if any of us have raised children, we know that what we're trying to do is to help them succeed. And she knew. She wasn't a sociologist. She wasn't a formally educated woman. She wasn't a political analyst, but she knew from her own experience and from what she saw that I would get more advantage by trying to pass. And so that's what I did for most of my childhood. And there were things that were at play that were shaping how she understood raising a child in the US, in Chicago, in the 1970s and 80s. There were things at play that she was addressing. And so I want to talk about what those things were in 5 waves. So I want to call them 5 waves of anti-Latino racism. And then I want to talk about the church's response and the Latina community's response. So 5 waves of anti-Latino racism, and then the Latina response, and then, sorry, the church's response, and then the Latina response. And I'm hoping that this sets a stage for us. We're going to go through a lot of information that hopefully you'll see patterns, less about remembering dates and more about seeing patterns. And then we'll come together and we'll do some conversation and some Q&A. So I'm hoping I can share my screen with you all. There we go. Hopefully you guys can see that. So the first wave of racism that I want to talk about is colonization or dehumanization. And this is the wave when we talk about things like manifest destiny, which if you all are not familiar with that term, you should be from Marx. Mark talks about it a lot. Really this war that happened in 1848, the US-Mexican War, was really a clarion call from white Americans of what they considered to be manifest destiny, which said that God had given Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or the white church, the divine destiny of conquering North America from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea, right? And so this was their not only belief, but it was their mission and kind of marching orders as white Christians to spread their form of Christianity and their way of living and their understanding of the world in any way they could, from sea to shining sea. And so that caused, obviously, the colonization of huge parts of what we now call the US, which were once a part of Mexico. And it continued in 1898 through 1902 as the United States continued and declares war on Spain in 1898. And then the Cuban Revolutionary Party strikes a deal with the US Congress in exchange for their help that they would intervene, the US would intervene, and that they would leave Cuba at the end of the war. But the US decides we're not going to leave Cuba at the end of the war. We're going to stay here until 1902, which is when Cuba then declares its independence from the US and is finally able to kind of start its own real independence in that sense. And then around that same time, the US claims Puerto Rico as a territory in another war. So this is kind of the advancement, not only of the West, but of American and US really colonization and occupation over other Latin American countries. In 1947, Puerto Rico finally becomes a Commonwealth, which doesn't, well, that's another story altogether, but where we still have power and influence over Puerto Rico. And so you can see that there was this kind of first wave, which we all maybe heard of. The ship is kind of showing that the colonization of Latin America from Spain and the French, and then from Europe, basically, and then the recolonization of Latin America through US occupation and US influence. That's one wave. And the next wave of anti-Latino racism, you guys, this picture brings so many feelings to me as someone who lives in Chicago, but has very strong connections to this border as we receive folks here in our city. So in 1921, it's the first time that there are limits on the number of immigrants that are allowed to come into the US. And this is imposed for the first time in 1921. In 1924, we have the Immigration Act, which includes efforts to keep American citizens who are Mexican from voting. So it's not that they're protecting the borders from people who are not citizens, but actually they're, because of their racism and their xenophobia, they're including Americans of Mexican descent who are citizens from voting. There was a process of forced sterilization laws that were introduced, and in 1924, the Border Patrol is created, which also is connected to our policing systems in our country. And so this way of understanding the policing and the movement of Latino bodies, whether on the coast of Miami or at the border of Texas, there is this understanding of the way that we police people's identity, whether or not they are citizens. And then in 1920, this is something that I think is very, very important for us to understand. In the 1920s and 30s, then we had a mass deportation, and there was a very, very strong anti-Mexican, specifically sentiment that spiked as the Great Depression came. So we can all understand, having gone through the last 5 years economically, that when the economy starts to be to tighten and to be pinched, the first people that are scapegoats for that conversation are people that are from that aren't understood or included or seen as belonging. So this is a question of belonging. And so there was a mass deportation where the United States forcibly removed 2 million people of Mexican descent from this country in the 1920s and 30s. And it is, depending on the literature that you look at, it's estimated that between 60 and 80% of the 2 million people that were deported were actually American citizens. They were people that were in our country that had gone through the process of naturalization and were here. And actually many of them, I'm sure, in Texas and in California were here before that piece of land actually became the United States of America. And so it wasn't that we were protecting our economy from other influences. It was that we were defining with those policies who was other, who belongs and who doesn't belong, who gets to stay and who doesn't get to stay, whether or not they had citizenship. So this is just a really, really dark and important part of our history, because we are experiencing a resurgence of this again in the last 10 years, especially, of just random, quote unquote, people being pulled over or being asked for papers. I think right now there's a lawsuit between the company, Greyhound, maybe, I think it was a bus company, and immigrants that were taken off of a bus in Portland. And so they weren't supposed to board the bus, but they just felt they could. And so they went onto this bus, and they don't ask. I mean, I know so many people who have been pulled over, incarcerated, detained, and they have papers. And so it's not a question of legality, really. It has never been a question of legality in our country. It has always been a question of who belongs and who doesn't belong. So the wave of anti-Latino racism that's seen in repatriation or deportation continues to this day. I'm going to cover all of the rest of Latin America in one slide. So economic exploitation. So the next wave, and I know I'm going through these very fast, but I think you can picture in your mind what these kinds of patterns look like. The next wave after colonization, which basically said, we're going to decide who's human, who has the dignity of being human, and who is savage or who is property. Then we had deportation, which said, we're going to decide as a country not only who's human, but who belongs. And then we had economic exploitation. And so in our own country, from 1951 to 1964, we had what was called the Bracero program, which was about labor supply. And so they were bringing in this period 350,000 Mexican workers into the US. And it was an initiative from the government to locate, actually to identify, locate, and deport undocumented workers. And so it was both, it was to bring in the workers. And then once we didn't need the workers anymore, or we felt, our economic situation was changing, there was anti-Mexican and anti-immigrant sentiment. White Americans or Americans wanted to have their jobs back, quote unquote, after reestablishing their families after our wars. Then we had what was called Operation Wetback. And this was where the government said, now you've come to this country to work and to make sure that we all have food on our tables. But now we want to make sure that we get rid of anyone, identify anyone who's undocumented, and get rid of anyone who's undocumented, who overstayed their working visa through the Bracero program. And they deport, our US government deports within this time, this 4 years, 3.8 million people of Mexican descent. Again, it doesn't say our government deported 3.8 million immigrants. It says, historically, we deported 3.8 million people of Mexican descent. And so we have the same kind of practices and patterns that we had in our deportation wave, which was to decide who gets to belong. And this shows us, I think, the economic evils and the economic exploitation that continues to happen even today when we allow workers to come in, and we have huge consequences for people who are undocumented or overstay their welcome, quote unquote, but we don't have any consequences for American companies or American agricultural firms that also are participating in that. So it's like, who gets penalized? You come to us because you're just a worker. You're not a human being. You're just an avenue to get our food, and then we send you back, and then you come back, and then we use you, and then we send you back, and you're disposable. So if you don't like it, and we underpay you, and we don't pay you at all, there's hundreds of others that would like this kind of job. And I don't know if you guys have, I don't know where you all live, but in my community, there is a corner where there's a gas station and a Home Depot, and every single day there are dozens of men that are waiting there for jobs. And we have relationship and connection to these men because some of them are congregants in our church. Some of them utilize some of the services that we provide at our community center, and to hear their stories of how people treat them as commodities and not as human beings, and the amount of injustice that goes along with our folks that are day laborers. It's just amazing to see the kinds of sentiment, the narrative about who our community is as not belonging or as property or as commodity for economic exploitation continues to this day. And we can talk more about that when we have our discussion. But when I was rereading some of the work that I've done in the past, I just was reminded again, of how much we were able to move from kind of political and national exploitation to just do the same kind of thing to the humanity of Latinos, but within an economic system instead of necessarily only working within a political system. I put this in here because I think it's very, very important, even as we see what's happening with Haiti right now, with Haiti, that the economic exploitation from the 1800s to the present has incredible consequences for what we're experiencing today. So Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and other Central American countries were economically exploited by the U.S., by U.S. corporations such as Chiquita. We have the Banana Republic, which most people in our generation only know as a clothing store, which frankly also exploits people, by the way. But the Banana Republic was a term that was used for countries that were experiencing poverty that you could go and invest in and or develop as a U.S. or European firm. And so the consequences of things like the Banana Republic in Central America, or sugar companies exploiting labor in the Caribbean, or foreign policies like the North American Free Trade Agreement that set up all the injustices along our border in the maquiladoras, U.S. mining in Colombia and Chile, all those ways that we went into other countries and purchased land from governments that didn't even belong to them, frankly. It belonged to the native folks that were in those countries. And so the economic gain and the prosperity of our country has a history and a rootedness in how we have treated others, our neighbors, our direct neighbors around us, which in our case would be Latin America. And this has incredible impacts on the economic welfare of those countries and the native indigenous peoples of those countries. And so when we look at a situation like Haiti right now, for example, a lot of the narrative is just like, oh, poor Haiti. They had this earthquake and they had this political thing happen, and now they're called poor Haiti. That's if you care, if people even care. It's poor Haiti. We have to help them because they're poor, and then we feel great about ourselves. because we helped them. But the reality is there's a history that France has with Haiti and that the US has with Haiti that contributed to the levels of poverty and injustice and corruption that are there. And so we are not the saviors or the solution to a problem. We were complicit and participants in that problem. And so we need to know our history, because as we talk about anti-Latino racism in our country and what's happening at our border right now, not only with Mexico, but certainly with Central America, we have to understand that movement of peoples from an incredibly beautiful, I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever been to Honduras, but Honduras is amazing. It is beautiful. So when I talk to my friends in my neighborhood, I'm like, why would you ever leave that amazing, literally heaven to come here? The answer is always economic, and economics attached to safety, physical safety. And those things have a history, and we're complicit, and we were participants in that history. If you want to know more about those kinds of things, there's a phenomenal book called Harvest of Empire that I will recommend to you at the end that talks about all these different countries and what has happened in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, and in Mexico, and why it's impacted the way people migrate to our country. So I remember in the 1990s, my father's Argentine, y'all. So he is political because they really watch the news about everything. And he started seeing all that was happening around NAFTA, and he became very concerned. He said, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And he began to and I said, oh my gosh, Dad, you're such a conspiracy theorist. Like, you're always thinking America's up to something, I was in a different world because I had so assimilated to fitting in that I was pretty much buying everything that I was being told in school with no filters and no suspicion, appropriate and healthy suspicion. And sure enough, my father has dementia now, so he can't really tell me he was right. But sure enough, over the last 10 years, all the things that my father said with his mouth are coming true as it pertains to the push-pull factors of immigration in Central America and in Mexico. And he called it every time because he saw how our foreign involvement and our foreign policy would have implications for how we experience things here. So I'm going to keep going because there's so much I can say there. Then there was Jim Crow. We all have learned a lot about Jim Crow. So I just wanted to point out that Latino and Latinas were also segregated in housing and schools and in pools, and all the same Jim Crow laws that applied to our African-American brothers and sisters and our Native brothers and sisters, they also applied to us. And by the 1940s, 80% of Latino children in California were in separate schools. In 1946, there was a huge case in the courts around the Mendez family, and Sylvia Mendez later on went on to win a Medal of Honor, I think under President Obama, for the work that she and her family had done to call out the injustice in the school segregation. That preceded Board versus the Brown of Education, Brown versus the Board of Education. And so it was a landmark case that was actually in two landmark cases that happened in Latina communities. In 1964, the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender, creed, race, or ethnic background. But we know that we have modern segregation today. Redlining, which is refusing loans to people because of the color of their skin or their racial or ethnic background, really, really shaped how suburban and urban communities were formed in the 60s and 70s. School funding by taxes. So the fact that you live in a particular district and your taxes go to those schools, the way that we have our tax system set up prefers white, wealthy suburbs over urban brown spaces. Gerrymandering for elections. We're experiencing a lot of this right now in the city of Chicago. There's whole committees that come together and they report every day on NPR in our city, how they're forming the districts so that you can get your elected officials and how to make that fair. So gerrymandering, like forming a voting district such that you retain power within that district. And so that has to do with our access to voting rights and our access to equitable voting. And then My favorite, NIMBY, not in my backyard. So we have a lot of that. I live in a neighborhood that's gentrifying. So we get so many times where we go to city council to talk about a housing complex that we're doing. For example, we have a Zapata housing units. There's 65 units that were put in right around my house here within the adjacent blocks. And we showed up as neighbors and as, a clergy from the community. And there were so many new people to the neighborhood that were like, not in my backyard, not here. This is going to be an eyesore. This is going to be a problem for my property value. And they literally had only lived in the neighborhood for about 5 or 6 years. Whereas the rest of us that were there, we've been here for much, much longer. So not in my backyard, showing IDs to access public housing. We had a massive, an incredible housing way for affordable housing in our community, but it was really led by African Americans and Puerto Ricans. And they never noticed along the way that the criteria and the prerequisite for accessing the housing would require driver's license and IDs that many of the people who had fought alongside of them for that housing could not access or could not get. And so the people who had fought and marched and protested and showed up at City Hall, hundreds of them did not have access to that housing because the way that the system was set up assumed citizenship. It assumed documentation. And so we had to go back to the drawing board on the next one because those things were already in place. And it was very, very painful, even between the Latina community, between the Puerto Rican and Cubans and documented Mexicans and the ones who were seeking asylum or were not documented. All that to say that we have so many systems of modern segregation that impact what I would like to point out is opportunities and networks. So kids that grow up in my neighborhood and go to my church and go to the schools in our neighborhood, when they're looking for jobs and internships and colleges, they may even have, let's say they even have the opportunity to get a full scholarship to go somewhere. They don't have the networks to be able to prepare them for that type of experience because they're not around other people who have had that experience. And so by segregating our communities, it's not only impacting us, definitely family separations, definitely economic opportunity, but our networks and who we know, because you get jobs by who you know. So my husband, all of his internships that led to all of his jobs, he's a smart guy, but a lot of them were like, oh, my mom was friends with the vice president of this organization. He gave my resume to the HR department. It's all that kind of stuff that is missing when we segregate economically and racially. This is just a slide to show you all that every step of the way, the Latina community has fought for itself. It has organized, it has prayed, it has marched. It has developed bilingual resources all along the way, fighting family to family to family to network to network to network. Community organizing, I think, was invented by Mexican grandmothers. So this is the way we know we have to fight for ourselves. And so those are the 5 waves then: colonization, repatriation or deportation, exploitation, segregation. I'm missing one. The 5th wave. This is actually the 5th wave. The 5th wave of anti-Latino racism is evangelization. So in my bio, you guys read or you guys heard that I belong to an organization that did a missions convention. It's one of the largest missions conferences for students to mobilize people for global mission called Urbana. And I was a worship leader and a platform leader and speaker. I was very, very involved for almost a decade. And one of the things I really realized was that the narrative in our evangelization has always been, historically, when we read, like when I took history of world missions, for example, in seminary, it was very clear that missionaries and social workers and teachers who are Christians focused on women and children. And this is why it happened. And we still do this in urban ministry. So pay attention to what we do in urban ministry. We go and we work with kids. And we teach our youth to work with kids and our college students to work with kids. And what they end up doing is it's a very relationship full of power, because you're going down, down. But very rarely do we ever see one another as peers. And so we're so comfortable in our evangelization, in our mission, in our development, even to work with people who we know we have more power over. And we come then with a message of hope and a message of liberation and freedom of the gospel that communicates that we are made in God's image, and that we are equals, and yet we relate, we communicate, and we make decisions in a way that is clearly not equal, because focusing and working with children and assuming that relationship is egalitarian that is a falsehood that we live under. And so this is our history. We worked with women and children, we assimilated them, we basically spiritually colonize them, we theologically colonize them. We told them they had to dress a certain way, pray a certain way, worship a certain way, believe a certain thing. And really it points to an invitation for us to confess the ways that we have operated out of American exceptionalism and triumphalism. We're going to go over there and we're going to bring God to the west side of Chicago. We're going to go to Central America. We're going to preach the good news to people who've never heard, even though the largest waves of revival have been in Central America over the last 2 decades. And the church is growing everywhere, including in Latin America, and shrinking in the US. And so we still have very much a colonizer mentality when it comes to our evangelism. And the way in which we communicate that to our communities, for example, is that we are in a cultural deficit. So we're taught, for example, that we're in a cultural deficit. And we are the mission field. We are the churches that people send serve projects to. We get the spring break, missions and spring break justice programs at our church. We are the ones that are receiving the help. We are very, very rarely ever the ones that are teaching, leading, advising. Although we have figured out how to plant churches without a denomination's huge budget. We've figured out how to do that. And yet we're asked to come and participate in church planting boot camps instead of being the leaders and teachers at those spaces. I could talk about that all day long. We're seeing it even this month. If you look at all these conferences and like the future of the church and the future of theology and revival in Christendom, and there are no Latinos who are leading and shaping and influencing those spaces. Institutions, academic institutions, denominations, missions agencies, development agencies reinforce racist attitudes as they went into our communities overseas and as they went into our communities here. And so we were actually taught to be suspect of our own spirituality that didn't come from someone else. And I think that's why we have such a strong movement of translating songs and books into Spanish from English. When we do that, we're basically saying a Western thought and a Western spirituality and a Western theology and a white church mentality is superior to that which Latinos could offer because they need us, versus saying, when was the last time that a publisher said, I would like to translate these 5 books from Spanish into English so that American Christians can understand what it looks like to love God in the midst of suffering and to believe and have hope that God is at work even when we can't see it. And so that mutuality and that reciprocity has not been there in missions. It has not been there in academia, and it rarely is there in our denominations. It's almost always, we're going to come and help. And I think Latinos feel this very, very strongly, and we're trying to find our voice. It's also why so many young Latinas and Latinos have left the church. Our history and our current practices in evangelization are causing and reinforcing American exceptionalism and supremacy, really. So what has been the Latina response? Oops, sorry, typo for that. What has been the impact on our identity in the Latino response? Well, in 2003, Latinos or Hispanics were pronounced the nation's largest minority group. So y'all, it's 2021, right? 2021. we're still absent from so many institutions and Christian spaces. But in the 1960s and 1970s, we began to find culturally contextualized ministries and theologies in missiology, for example, FTL and AED, which are still working today. So many organizations formed because we realized that we have something to offer. Catholic Latinos, especially leading the way in challenging inequity. And so there's a movement within our community to say, we've experienced all of this injustice, and our response can't just be to hide and to kind of be crushed under it. We have to develop new ways. And so I want to leave you with a couple of things that I think are the gifts of the Latina church, and Sister Dina here can take us from there. But I think a couple of gifts I think we offer to, if we're listened to, I think our Teología en Conjunto, which is exactly how those culturally contextualized ministries were formed. It was communities who got together and said, hey, I went to this seminary, I learned this, and hey, I was pastoring here and I learned this, and hey, I was preaching the gospel in the prisons and I was learning this. Can we come together and figure out, like, what is our theology of freedom? What is our theology of grace? What is our theology of the church? What is our ecclesiology? How do we understand the end of all things? And we began to do teología en conjunto, like together, doing theology together. So many people have written about this, but I think spiritualidad found in lo cotidiano, so like a spirituality and a faith found in the everyday. That's where we get our terms like abuelita faith, like understanding that our grandmothers, who had many of them, no formal education, they taught us how to pray, they taught us how to worship, they taught us how to love and serve. They taught us, if you had 2 coats, you give one because the other person is cold and you don't need a fashion wardrobe. They're the ones that taught us how to live our faith out. Misión Integral, which came through folks like Samuel Escobar and Rede Padilla, and were reinforced by folks like Elizabeth Conde Frazier, an idea that we do holistic mission, that we do holistic ministry, that people are mind, body, and spirit, that they're whole beings, and that whether or not their family is in danger matters to whether or how they experience God and the truth about God. I think Latinos have sought historically to be gente of healing and reconciliation in the liminal in-between spaces. And so this space that we find ourselves now in wanting to find unity and a way forward together in the church that embraces our differences and acknowledges that we're not the same, but that we are equal, that space is something I think Latinos have a lot to offer in, because we're having to work it out in our own communities. Thank you.
Wow, Sandra, this has been amazing. You have gifted us so much in what you've shared. I think about even abuelita theology, that sprung a chord with me, and thinking about I am who I am today because somebody lived beyond the field worker idea, or that was their space. They lived into their faith as a space of freedom. And even though during the day they were caught in a systemic problem and in a marginalized space, during their spirituality, they were more free. And I think about that's who I am today because of that, because of the courageousness of someone like my abuela, who planted 7 churches. And so I think about the gift to the church. But let me go back to what you shared early on. What stuck with me is this idea of belonging. Christ invites us to be part of the body, and yet somehow through the manifest destiny, it did not manifest itself into everyone belonging to the body of Christ. Tell me about, how do we lament that? How do we own that? How do we wrestle now with the ways in which white supremacy kept people from fully belonging?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Emmanuel Katangale and Chris Rice, in their book, Reconciling All Things, they talk about how lament is the practice of seeing and naming and standing in pain, of seeing and naming and standing in pain. And I think that for me, I mean, I think first of all, it's a gift that the Latina community brings, and definitely other communities of color where how could we possibly not see? I mean, we're seeing things like when I see the pictures of my brothers and sisters, carrying their children over their head back and forth over the river to get food. I mean, no, we're not from the same country. No, we're not of the same race, myself and them, but I'm drawn in to see their pain. Yes. I'm drawn in to name their pain. I'm drawn in to stand in it with them and to say that's no, this is not what God wanted. This is not at all. So we want to go to Haiti and do earthquake relief and wear our t-shirts, our matching t-shirts, and take our pictures and go to a nice resort afterwards to contribute to the local economy. But when they show up at our doorstep, we're going to say, no, you're not human. And if you were to replace all those pictures on that river with blonde white children, things would change. We just know they would. And so we see that in our own communities. So I think that the invitation to lament, it restores our own humanity. I think that it's not about making people feel bad. It's not about making people feel guilty. It's about liberating yourself from the narratives that you have inside about who you are and who other people are and who belong and who doesn't belong. I think that lament releases that for us. It really, if you've ever been to my church is primarily Puerto Rican and with a mixture of African-American and Mexican, but you go into the church and during prayer time, before you start worship, it's like just the wailing that's being released before you begin to lift up your voice in worship and song. It's a release. It's an invitation to be released from spiritual constipation. How could you possibly?
Yes.
How could you possibly have hope or possibly desire to have a different world if you didn't name how bad things really were in the world? Why do we need a savior if there isn't anything to be saved? Why do we need a healer if there isn't anything to be healed? And so I think lament is that invitation to say, I'm gonna look at that. I'm gonna say, it's really that bad. And I'm gonna name that. That's evil. That's sin. That is looking at another human being and deciding that they are not made in God's image and worth less than me because of a paper that's in their hand.
Yeah.
And I think we need to name it. And then we need to, from there, we can be with them and stand in the pain and then create, make creative solutions for a way out, which I don't know those solutions, but I do know that it starts with the invitation to lament is not for them. It's for you. It's for us collectively. Yeah. Because we're so spiritually constipated. We're always just like, yay, Jesus, yay. But we haven't been willing to go to the low places that show us how twisted, how twisted we really are as humanity, and how we continue to live in twisted systems.
Yes. I think you nailed it when you mentioned economy. And if anything, the scripture speaks to is money, right? The love of money. It is when this becomes a priority. And I think we can look at history and we've understood not just slavery, but the taking of land, the lynching, the ways in which our stronghold for greedism has caused us to continue to sin and build upon that sin, right? So here we are now, hundreds of years later, in a space where we are still looking at the price tag of documentation or the price tag of a human. What's the prophetic call to the church when it comes to money? What do we do with this?
Well, a friend of mine, a mentor and friend, when we were in DC, and she had the opportunity to go to the African American History Museum. She's a Black American woman. She went to the History Museum. And when she came back to the event we were doing, which actually was an event on immigration, she said, I said, what was it like for you? And she said, I learned two things. I learned that you have to follow the money, because slavery was as much about economics and greed as it was about race. And we needed to convince ourselves something about someone else's humanity in order to use people as property. And imagine what that does to your heart that you've done that. And she said the second thing I learned was to look at the women and listen to the women and what the women were doing. And I think the same is true for our world that we live in right now. You know, like I think about what can we do? I mean, I think we have to pay attention to organizations that we invest in, organizations that we buy in. Like there are certain home goods store, a home, what do you call it? Homework, stores that I don't buy at. There are certain chain stores that I don't buy at because I know that their money and their work, their lack of accountability in other countries causes injustice and exploitation of women and children, and it ruins lives. They don't care for the environment. I mean, I'm looking at that stuff. Right. I think that we can be serious about our investments. So y'all, if you have a 401k or an IRA or something like that, you need to be looking at the funds that you invest in, because most of those really large, well-earning funds are invested in the exploitation of others, because that's where the money is. How are you going to have profits for your, I mean, frankly, number three, I don't use Amazon. I just don't use it, because we know from our neighbors and our helpers that the organization doesn't care for its workers. And so that's exploitation. What's more important to me, that I don't pay the $5.95 for the shipping, or that my brother or sister is being treated like a human being and not having to wear a diaper to go to the bathroom so they don't take a break to go pee? Those are just real. I'm just being real with y'all. Very real things we can do.
That's exactly.
Where we shop matters, where we invest our money. If you're going to invest in the expansion of the gospel and evangelism and mission, invest in Latinas that are doing mission in the Middle East, because they're more well received. Their culture is more similar. They blend in better. They're not American, So we send a ton of our kind of proclamation, what we would put in that category, like proclaiming the gospel, offerings. That we support Black and Latino and Indigenous missionaries overseas from their countries of Bolivia, et cetera, into other countries, because we just believe that's the future. They're under-resourced. They're already cross-cultural. They're already bilingual. And they're going to be differently accepted than a person with a US passport. And so there are very tangible things you can do. You can purchase a home that isn't just for yourself. You can purchase a home that has a flat upstairs or downstairs and provide affordable rent for those that are coming in and establishing their lives as asylum seekers. Or, I mean, there's so many things you can do. People are so creative. I mean, go on Instagram. People are doing some really creative things, especially this generation. They're being very, very creative about who they fund, where they invest, which is also, frankly, y'all, why so many people are not tithing to their local church. So, but this is what we try to do. We try to gather young people, because Chasing Justice is the organization I work with. It's really focused on 18 to 30. So it's kind of like between I have a paycheck and I have a mortgage. So they actually have some money and maybe a job, first job out of college type thing, or they're working and paying their way through school, and 30, which is like, I have a mortgage and I can't do anything. We try to catch them in that space, and we teach them things like, nowhere does the Bible say only give 10%, only budget your tithe, and then spend the rest on yourself. So when we ask them, well, what's your vacation budget? And they're like, I don't know. I just go to what I have to go to. So you cap your tithing at 10%, but your vacation budget, you don't have that. So it's unlimited vacation, but limited investment in the care and concern of others in your church. And so we tell them, we teach them things like it's not that 90% belongs to you and 10% belongs to God. It's that all of it belongs to God.
That's right. That's right.
And you are a steward. You're literally just a steward of those things. So let me give you some creative ideas of how you might want to think about your money. With parents, we work with parents and we tell them, we have those banks. I don't know if you guys have seen those banks. They're like, it's three little quadrants, and it's like spend, share, save. So we work with our kids and we're like, okay, every week you get an allowance, and every week you put your $1, $2 in, spend, share, save. Well, I want to buy this truck, which my son Terry always wants to buy a truck. And I'm like, great. I want you to have that truck. How much money do you have? And I can't be like, well, we can't afford the truck. We totally can afford the truck. My husband has a great job, that's just not how we're going to spend our money, Papi. That's not how we're going to spend it. So, how would you like to, and then they have their sharing money that they can either give to the community center at church or to the church itself. Sometimes they give it to folks that we meet on the street. They're building relationships with people, under our bridges and by their schools, learning their names, sharing about their soccer games. So there's a lot of things we're trying to reorient ourselves from how the world teaches us to live with our possessions. That's another talk altogether, but
we could stay on for hours. Honestly, this has been amazing. I'm going to invite those who are participating, who are in this webinar, to put your questions in chat. And Krista Dutt is going to lead the next part of this conversation. But before I leave, Sandra, a couple of things. One is you contributed a chapter in a book called Still Evangelical, which came out right after this election, this polarized space in our political country. And you joined in a voice in a conversation after numbers were sharing how critically evangelicals had participated in the leadership of a presidential candidate. And I want you to just give us a glimpse. Why did you write in a book called Still Evangelical?
Yeah, so I was asked and I said no. And it wasn't because I didn't want to write in the book. It was because I didn't want to be the only Latina writing in the book. I wanted there to be another Latino voice because I didn't want it to be like, this is the Latino voice. I don't like that. So I was like, can we please have someone else? So they put out some more invitations. So there's a couple of us. And I wrote it because I am an evangelical theologically. Like, I believe in the centrality of scripture. I believe in the work of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection. I believe in the power of the Holy Spirit to change and transform society. I'm ordained in a Reformed tradition, which I'm not as Reformed as my Reformed tradition, but I believe that our presence in the world makes a difference. I have the image of Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia as the king, as God is the king who wherever Aslan walks, it's springtime. And no matter how cold or no matter how difficult the environment is, wherever Aslan goes and wherever the subjects of Aslan goes, there's springtime. And so I feel like we as Christians should be reforming and changing society. So my chapter is called Remaining to Reform. And I say I am. Theologically, I am an evangelical. Politically, I'm not an evangelical. If the way the news wants to talk about. And I wrote it because I wanted them to know that I would never say I'm evangelical. That's what I said in the book. I would never say I'm evangelical because evangelicals don't consider me. Like, they don't think about me when they're thinking about evangelicals. And so therefore I wouldn't say that I would say that I'm evangelica. I'm a Latina, Pentecostal-ish,
that's right,
community born, fronterista. I'm always in the middle, in the frontera, crossing over between, spaces. And I think that it's important for people to know and see that we're here, that the fastest growing population in the US, the fastest, one of the most vibrant churches in our country and in the world is in Latin America. And we have something to say and we have something to offer and we want to offer it for the healing of the whole church. And so if you would consider us, then you might actually receive something. And that's why I wrote the chapter. I end the chapter by saying, I'm really not interested in resuscitating a corpse. And if white evangelicalism and if the church in its form in America is dead, then let the thing die. Just let it die. Because where there's death, there's rebirth, and I'm just not interested in saving institutions. I'm interested in the reclamation and the restoration and the transformation of the world. And so I want to be a part of that. But if there is a remnant in that old structure, then let's crack away the stone on the outside and see what's underneath it, so yeah, I wrote it because I'm truly like, I mean,
Yeah.
I preach, I read the Bible, I do a devotional, I tithe, you know, like I share my faith, you know, I serve those around me, I neighbor. That's what an evangelical does, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's who I am. I wish that white movements, organizations, and academic spaces and publishing would consider us as part of their community, because we're not the ones losing out.
Yeah,
they are.
I feel like the church needs to say to the Latino community, tag, you're it. You're it to lead, because you are the bridge builder. You're the multicultural, multilingual, multi-generational. You're the one that's been living in this space, and you've been doing church en conjunto with each other. And it's now the time for us to bring part of that solutions and part of that leadership into a country that is definitely losing its integrity in the public world. Well, I want to invite now Krista Dutt to join us. There she is. She's got some questions for us today.
Thank you so much, Sandra Marie. This has been so eye-opening, and we're getting some good questions. So the first question I would love to pose to you is, how do you propose starting conversations in our churches about the problem of money? That is, what's next? That's what I hear you saying. And how can we make the standing with part of lament mean anything real when we use our money to insulate ourselves from so many problems?
Oh yeah, gosh, I didn't know we were going to be talking about money so much, but okay, money. Yes, I love talking about money. We're actually going to have the young adults in our church over to talk about finances in a couple of weeks. I probably the reason that money came up today and that I love talking about it so much is because I think really wealth, money, and capitalism in the way that we practice it in the US is idolatry to us. I think it's such a strong idolatry that we will make decisions. I mean, it shows. We vote against our own interests as Christians on a local, state, and national level because of our fear around finances and security and safety and wealth and comfort. And so we do that because it's idolatry. We're holding on to it so strongly. I don't know that very often, I don't know that I talk specifically about money. I'm not afraid to talk about money. I talk about it all the time, but I don't like choose money as a topic to talk about. I think the topic we really need to talk about is solidarity, neighboring, loving, like how do we love our neighbor? How can we love our neighbor? The kids that your kids go to school with, the people that sit in our congregation, the church 2 blocks away, if they can't pay their lights and we're like replacing the carpet for the 3rd time, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense. So a love that is practiced, or a solidarity that is practiced that doesn't include the sharing of resources, whatever those resources are, is not love. It's not love. And so I would say, how do we develop relationships of reciprocity and mutuality in our church and between churches and in our community that allows us to have an exchange of resources? Whether that's providing jobs, the person provides their skill, you provide wealth, whether that's providing, I don't know what that is, but we're really looking for relationships of reciprocity. And we're looking to ask questions about structures. How do I neighbor well when I know that all the tax money, all the TIF money, tax incentive money is coming from 26th Street, which is a Mexican neighborhood, which is one of the busiest and most financially prosperous spaces in our city, next to Michigan Avenue, which is like where y'all go to the Apple store and Louis Vuitton and all that. It was the second most prosperous when the city, the aldermen and the city officials tried to take TIF funding away from that neighborhood to build a school downtown for wealthy kids that were moving into the loop of Chicago. And the school that was in that town wasn't big enough for them, and it wasn't meeting the needs of the students there. And so it's not just about your own money. It's about raising your voice when you see economic exploitation around you. It's about raising your voice when Amazon wants to pay people like nothing and cut their breaks and then have its CEO fly to the moon. Like those are things that we need to speak to. It's entertaining news, but it's really an indictment on where we're at as a society, that some people are so bored they need to go and fly to another, to the moon, while some people are literally like with their child crying in their hand and malnourished because they don't know how to feed them. This is us as a humanity. There is enough food to feed the entire world. There are enough vaccines to vaccinate the entire planet right now. And some of us are getting a booster while most of Africa has not gotten its first shot. These are all economic decisions. And so I think we start by paying attention. And I don't think you like jump into all that. I think you started with, how am I neighboring right here on Armitage Avenue? How am I neighboring right here? How am I raising my voice for equity in education, concern and care for workers? Protection during COVID when people are serving us. There was no shutdown, y'all. There was no shutdown. It was just wealthy people with means ordering food to their house. That's what it was. People kept working. And so we have to understand that that is the economics of what we live in, and name those things, and then just make some decisions. Every day you make a different decision. Every day you add a little bit more. In our small group, so if you lead small groups in your churches, we had open budget. We said, come to small group with your budget, because y'all don't have a mortgage yet, you're paying rent. And let's talk about how we spend our money and why. But it wasn't a one-off about money. It was a journey about neighboring and loving.
That's so powerful. Thank you. I am fangirling right here, right now. So I'll fully admit that. Another question we have is, what is the single most important U.S. national level immigration policy that you think would have the greatest positive impact, and how should the church and faith-based organizations get involved? Only a small question.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm so thankful for organizations like World Relief and We Welcome, and I'm sure your denomination has its own kind of a justice advocacy component. But I would say pay attention to those emails and those posts, because right now we are just trying to get President Biden to get rid of Title 42, which is the way that they're keeping all the Haitians and Central Americans at the border right now and not letting them in, because they're saying it's a national security health issue. And we all know that it's a human rights issue right now. So there's a way around that. Vaccinate them and let them in, test them and let them in. But Title 42 was started under the Trump administration, and Biden, who made all these promises about immigration, who has not fulfilled any of them, really. I mean, he's out there like now claiming Title 42. So I would say, look at the We Welcome. If your own denomination doesn't have one, look at the We Welcome Instagram or Facebook, and they have a petition you can sign, or you can go to Chasing Justice. We also have a link to all those petitions. So at Chasing Justice _, and you can basically do that. We had one time in our small group where we were specifically advocating for dreamers. So if you guys don't know, our country has still not passed any kind of DREAM Act, which allows people who are brought here as children, small children who are raised here and who only know this as their country and went to school here and serve in our military, et cetera, to have a pathway towards citizenship. And so what we have right now is DACA, which is just deferred. And so every couple of years they have to like apply again, say, hey, I'm still here. I don't want to be sent back to Mexico or to Honduras because I left when I was 1 and I don't speak the language and I don't know the customs and I don't have family there. And so we did this thing with evangelicals Christians for Social Action, where they put a small group kit together. And with all of our 12 small group members and our 11 children, we prayed for dreamers and we wrote prayers for them. Some kids just drew pictures because they can't write yet. And we prayed for our dreamers, some of whom were in our small group and some of whom are in our congregation, who don't have security in their status. And so we came alongside of them and we taught our kids to pray for them, and we prayed for them, and we put all those prayers in an envelope and we sent them over to Christians for Social Action, and they went to DC and stood in the Capitol and were arrested to hand in those. I think CCDA was a part of it. I think a lot of organizations were a part of it. But campaigns like that are going on, you're not going to solve the whole thing at one time, but there are some attainable things, like we should have a worker program that is like not from 1965. Okay. We have not had any substantial comprehensive immigration reform since the 60s. It's time. But in the meantime, we can at least say, hey, don't enact Title 42. Like, that's not fair. That's during this humanitarian crisis. Like, have a pathway for people to apply. People have the legal right to apply for asylum if they get to our border. Let them apply for asylum. Let them go through the court systems. And if they go through the court systems and they're sent back, then that's one thing. But give them a chance, because they according to our policies, they have the right to present themselves for asylum, but we're not letting them present themselves. And so churches can get involved in that. You can write your senators, write your congressmen, write our administration, write to Kamala, who made a lot of promises, raise your voice. There are so many petitions and things you can sign. So prayer, petitions, local actions, like if there's a march in your community, participate in that as a small group and as a church, make that a part of your spiritual act of worship. I think there's so many things we could do.
Thank you. Another question is that one of Mennonite Central Committee's vocations is to create educational opportunities for our constituency. But when it comes to education within the organization, our tendency is to look for and overload people of color within MCC in regards to efforts to address this racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and so on. MCC being a predominantly white organization, and so there's that power dynamic things going on there. What are your thoughts on this issue, and how can we move on to a different model of educating ourselves as an organization in order to contribute to efforts in our local communities?
Yes. Okay, so yes, absolutely. This happens in every organization. Whoever had this question, it happens in every organization. It's like the people of color have 7 jobs. A professor of color in an academic institution has to teach their classes, publish, all the things, show up at task forces and committee meetings having to do with diversity and equity, mentor students of color, right? Teach extra classes on diversity and equity within evangelism or whatever topic they're teaching in. So this is absolutely true. And then be a person. And then the other job is to actually be a person cross-culturally within a predominantly white institution that could be Swedish or Dutch or German and historically, so you're like, oh my, I'm feeling myself here. And the added therapy that comes with that experience. So there's a lot of work for peoples of color. I think that doing kind of what you guys are doing right now is really important, like bringing in voices from outside of your community that the people from within your community, would champion. Like, you don't want to bring in a person from the outside if they're like, none of the Latinos are like, we don't like Sandra, we don't like what she says, and she doesn't represent us. Then don't invite me, because that would be offensive to them and not really empowering. But I think if you bring people from the outside that can come alongside of and serve as friends or support to the messages that are already being said on the inside, that's very important, because we come with our own experience. I don't pastor and work in a predominantly Mexican-American experience. Mine is predominantly Black and Puerto Rican and Central American, actually. So I'm Colombian and Argentine. So I'm like, I can come alongside of my brothers and sisters that have different experiences and kind of fill out the picture. I think reading book clubs are amazing. So I think all of you could read, worship leaders within and lead pastors within the denomination could read the next worship and ask questions about how do we develop spaces that create hospitality and solidarity and mutuality within our worship and preaching and practices, that don't require for a person of color to be there, because a person of color already wrote the book. And so you're going to go through those. And then once you've done that reading, then you can have someone come in. So I think a lot of it's like, what are people willing to invest? And I used to have people within my parachurch that I worked for be like, can I have a conversation with you? Because I really want to, I feel like we're getting a lot more Latino. This was like 20 years ago. We're getting a lot more Latino students, and I really want to know how to reach out to them. I was like, awesome. There's a book by Orlando Crespo called Being Latino in Christ. You should read that. And once you're done reading that book, set up a 1-hour call with me and I'll talk to you. We can talk about where you had your questions and kind of next steps. That means they do 4 hours of work. That makes our 1 hour together very effective. Right? And then you pay me because that's expertise. You don't just think I'm going to do you a favor, because someone would never do that to a white man with expertise. They would pay them for their consulting, right? And I got that a lot. Hey, can I talk to you about can I take you out for a cup of coffee and I can talk to you about worship? I was like, awesome. Here's a book that I wrote. Here's another book that another Black brother wrote. Read those 2 books. When you're done with those 2 books, we can talk about having me come out and we can talk about it. But I think you will get so much more if you do some pre-work, like watch these movies, listen to these podcasts, talk to within your friendships where you have connection, missions partners, wherever your connections are, have those conversations. And then once you're done with those things, then talk to the people within your organization, because they're not going to do your work for you. Do the work. We had to do the work. And so I think if an organization is serious about it, they will do the work. And a lot of them do, like entire, a publishing company that all read, a certain book on cultural intelligence and racialized experiences of peoples of color to understand authors of color that would be writing for them. And then they had a think tank, a group that came together of Latino and Latina authors. And they were like, tell us about what people want to read. Tell us about what you want to read. Tell us about what you want to write. Tell us about what your community needs. And then we'll talk about and then they equipped us in exchange with how do you write a book proposal? And how do you understand navigating marketing of a book? And so we had an exchange of information, and in conjunto, again, in community, we were able to do things. And I think 6 books came out of that experience of those 20, 25 people that got together. So I think that communities like yours can do a lot, but it would require that you don't wait for that person to be they might not even have a particular passion for diversity and equity. They might have a passion for theology, or they might have a passion for, prison ministry, or they might have a passion for church planting. So we unless you're going to pay them 2 salaries, you really need to do some work outside of it.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I know that there's a lot of love for you in the chat, and also a lot to think about as we go forth as an organization and personally. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's great to be with you guys. And please, I hope I don't know if you guys are going to send a follow-up email, but please do check out Harvest of Empire. I think they have a movie on Prime, on Prime and on Netflix. Their movies on there, Harvest of Empire, and it's kind of a history of Latino. There's also a really great PBS special that I have some links for. I can give them to Dina, but it's basically also has some timelines and stuff like that for understanding Latino history. But PBS has some there's 3 Latino specials on PBS. One is called The American Experience. The other is called Latino America. So if you want to continue learning, and they're all free, you just click on them and they just play for you on PBS. So there are ways you can continue to learn. If you specifically want to learn about the movement of faith and Christianity within Latinidad, I would highly recommend The Brown Church by Robert Chao Romero. I would recommend Hermanas by 3 women who are both theologians and practitioners and then Kat Adamas just finished publishing her Abuelita Faith that just came out by Brazos. And so that's an amazing book about how we as Latinos develop our sense of spirituality and theology by listening to Women on the Margins. So those are all great resources if you want to continue to read and learn. And obviously you can follow us at Chasing Justice. We're celebrating Hispanic and Latinx Heritage Month, so we'll be putting up stuff too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of those resources and for sharing your heart and mind with us today.
Thank you.
So as a part of this webinar series, we have been giving out 5 books by Mark Childs and Chichung Ra, Unsettling Truths. And so Emmanuel will pull up our little circle of raffle, and we will figure out who gets the books. Woo! Okay, Danica, we will get a book for you. Good job, Karen. We will get a book for you. Yay, Jen! We will get a book for you. Giving out. Okay, we have one more. Good job, everybody. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar series and this specific webinar. Again, we give thanks for Sandra Maria's heart and mind as she worked with us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Thank you so much for your time, and we will be in touch about the next webinar. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Dina. And as we move into our closing prayer, I'm very pleased to introduce a new member of our team, Daniela Lazaro Manalo. She's going to give our closing prayer today. Daniela joined the National Advocacy and Program Department as Racial Equity Education and Advocacy Coordinator just a couple of weeks ago, working from Southern California. And she is focusing on church education and training, while there's another yet to be hired position that will focus internally on education and changes within MCC. Daniela has a master's in ethnic studies from California State University and was director of human resources for a multi-business company in West Hollywood, California. So please do give a warm welcome to Daniela when you meet her. And now, Daniela, I turn it over to you for our closing prayer.
Thank you, Tammy. I appreciate that. Happy to be here. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you that each breath is an opportunity to begin again. We thank you for Sandra's spirit, for her calling, her insight, and your message through her. We come before you today and recognize that this journey towards understanding and change will never be an easy one, but it will be liberating, and it will be fruitful. Lord, it's our prayer that we may remain open and courageous as we confront the violent legacies that continue to devastate our communities of color today. We pray that we can hold fast to the knowledge that this change must first take place in our hearts before it can happen anywhere else. Today and every day, we ask that you keep us mindful, that you keep us humble, and that you keep our eyes open to truth, to what your love truly looks like. In your holy name, we pray. Amen.